Speculation continues to run rampant about North Korea's future course of action on the Korean Peninsula. So why is Kim Jong-un's recent visit to a naval shipyard sparking concerns? What are the prospects of peace through strength? And is dialogue off the table with regard to regional tensions? Hello and welcome. You're watching Issues and Insiders for this Tuesday here in Korea. I'm Min Sunhee. Is North Korea looking to wage war against South Korea remains the biggest question with regard to tensions on the Korean Peninsula. And for the latest on this, I have Thomas Maresca here in the studio. Thomas, it's been a while. Welcome back.
Thanks. Great to be here.
I also have Steven Borowiec with us. Steven, it's good to see you.
Nice to be here.
Right, Thomas, as I mentioned at the start during the clip, North Korea's Kim Jong-un is raising fresh concerns, or has raised fresh concerns, that is, following a visit to a naval shipyard last week. Now, I'm aware you covered this particular event. Could you tell us more?
Yes, well, it's really the latest in a series of visits that Kim has been doing, kind of tied to a flurry of weapons tests and other sorts of military-related developments in North Korea. So this was last week. North Korean state media reported his visit to Naval Shipyard on the west coast of North Korea. Basically he was there to inspect naval projects. They didn't really specify what. It was just kind of along the same vein of the type of rhetoric that has been going on, this kind of heated, bellicose rhetoric. He was discussing how important it was for the Navy to build up for war preparations, and he referenced the 5-year plan that he had laid out in 2021 about this kind of shopping list of weapons that they're looking to develop and how important naval strength is. And he previously had inspected a nuclear submarine development site, and it's kind of in the context of this heightened tension. I think one thing that maybe stuck out to some observers about this particular visit was this is the first time that we think he was reported to have visited this particular shipyard on the West Coast, in any kind of a military context. Usually subs and submarine-launched missiles have been developed on Sinpo shipyard on the East Coast. So, and that West Coast, that West Sea, Yellow Sea, has been the site of a lot of tensions and provocations recently. North Korea last month fired artillery near this northern limit line and near Yeongbyo Island. Kim has specifically referenced that de facto maritime border as a real point of contention. He said last month that, if South Korea even violates it by like 1,000th of a millimeter, it would be a war provocation. And that kind of is also in line with just the level of almost North Korea seems to be kind of giving themselves a rhetorical runway to do something, to say, see, we told you, so that's, and a lot of that action now is focused on that side of the country and that sea. So that's something that maybe people are keeping an eye on. Is there something happening on the west coast in that West Sea to be concerned with?
Right, indeed, which is why the biggest question, like I mentioned earlier, Stephen, is North Korea weighing war with South Korea? Now, based on your interactions with pundits regarding this particular issue, what are your thoughts?
The consensus I've come away with is that there's no immediate indication that a war is in the offing. I don't think North Korea has said anything or done anything that they couldn't later back away from, or that doesn't kind of rhyme with things that they've already done before. I mean, one move that they made that got a lot of attention was this branding of South Korea as an enemy, and saying that they were, no longer interested in peaceful reunification, that they were going to, from there on, consider South Korea to be an antagonistic state. Or North Korea has said things like that before, and North Korea's constitution still is as of yet unchanged, and they still do consider the whole Korean Peninsula to be their territory, and they still do think, at least on paper, they still do consider South Korea to be a part of the same country, not an antagonistic country. And I know Kim Jong-un has mentioned that he doesn't want to change that, but until they actually do, I think the situation is pretty fluid. And again, if you really parse what they say very closely, it's a lot of things like, there was the one statement from North Korea official media, like, we will not avoid a war. Something that tends to kind of get lost in a lot of the English language coverage of North Korea is that, like, almost always what they say is, if we are attacked, we will wage war. If we are, if the enemy forces encroach on us to any extent, then we will respond with force, and we do this. Generally, they don't say, like, we are going to launch a war of aggression and we are going to retake the South. That's generally not what they say. I'm not aware of them saying that in any kind of recent history. I was just last week on the island that Thomas referred to, Yeonpyeong-do, and I'd been there a couple of times before. It's a kind of, sort of bellwether for tensions. It's a place that journalists like to go to get a sense of how things are playing out. And a lot of these stories can, over the years, someone who's been here as long as I have, it can come to seem kind of repetitive. But one thing that I was a little bit surprised with on this most recent visit was people did tell me that they felt more nervous or more scared than they had in the past. And the reason that they gave to that is they said, look at how North Korea has continued to develop new and more dangerous weapons. If you compare the situation to even just several years ago, let alone, in 2010, there was a serious shelling there. People said, we are dealing with a different North Korea now because they have all of these, they have underwater nuclear drone systems. They have a whole bunch more sophisticated missiles. They have successfully launched a reconnaissance satellite. So the situation on the ground there did indicate that we are in a more potentially dangerous scenario. And so we'll have to see how things go moving forward. But I would just say that there is no indication that war is about to break out. But I do think that we need to be vigilant and try to be as careful as possible so that things don't reach a potentially untenable scenario.
Right. And going back to something that Steven just mentioned, perhaps it is the advances in North Korea's military ambitions that has encouraged South Korea, the US, and Japan to take on a more peace through strength policy, so to speak, instead of just peace through pure diplomacy. What do you believe are the pros and cons of this assertive stance?
Well, I think, the idea of approaching North Korea with pure diplomacy, the way things are now, is really, pretty much off the table, or it's very, very hard to imagine. I mean, North Korea has signaled that they really have little to no interest in engaging, and, they've made very clear that the idea of any talk around denuclearization, I mean, nuclear weapons are completely off the table for any basis for discussion. And, at the same time, clearly the advances that Steven mentioned in North Korea's, weapons arsenal and capabilities does call for, the US and South Korea to respond. I mean, I think the US has had to sort of try to show South Korea, reassure South Korea that extended deterrence is real, and then, in terms of bringing, nuclear ballistic missile submarine here, B-52 bombers, things that, haven't been done in a long time, but then it also becomes a bit circular when then North Korea uses that as sort of pretext or subtext for why they're developing their weapons. So, there's a way that it does kind of, both sides feed off one another. I mean, I think when it comes to the rhetoric around peace through strength, from South Korea, from this Yoon administration, sometimes the hard words are not necessarily, I don't think it changes anything in terms of North Korea. It may play well to some faction in the domestic audience, but, that's something that I don't know how helpful that is. I mean, that's a case where, you also don't want to say something that you don't give yourself a bit more of an off-ramp in terms of, saying how you're going to respond if this or that happens. And, that also sort of feeds into North Korea's rationale for taking its own stance. So, I think it would be great if diplomacy was back on the table. It's not to say, who knows what the world will look like in a year. I mean, there could be a lot of things that change. Right now, it just seems North Korea is completely fixated on, achieving its goals, this 5-year plan, say, or, getting to a point of, where it feels confident enough in its nuclear capabilities that, if they do want to come back to the table, they'll be coming back from a different position of strength. So for now, it seems like this is where we are, but I think you have to keep leaving the door open and trying and seeing maybe there'll be some situations that evolve, maybe as this year goes on too. This is a year with big elections in the US and here as well with the National Assembly. So there's also a lot of thought that North Korea is trying to kind of play that game a bit and amplify.
Right. There are some pundits, Stephen, who claim that South Korea, aside from showing strength, should also seek to engage its neighbors like China and Russia to bring North Korea back to the negotiating table. What are your thoughts on this? And do you see Beijing and Moscow responding positively to such potential efforts by Seoul?
Those three countries appear to be kind of closing ranks and increasingly relying on each other and increasingly kind of shutting off diplomacy with the rest of the world. So I think it's probably unlikely that at this point Beijing or Moscow would seek to use any influence with North Korea to push North Korea into that direction, to say that what North Korea really ought to be doing is engaging in dialogue with South Korea or the US. I think that's unlikely. We've seen, particularly when it comes to North Korea and Russia, we've seen that these are two countries who are in kind of similar positions of isolation and have discovered that they can work together to benefit each other. Russia is in the midst of a very long and brutal slog in its war in Ukraine, and its access to simple munitions has emerged as this really important variable in that conflict. Which side can just replenish its arms on the front line appears to be making a big difference as to how that goes in the coming months. And so North Korea has stepped in there, and North Korea also has something that it wants from Moscow and with regard to technical help for its nuclear programs and its space exploration programs and all the rest. So those are two countries that I think have always had kind of cordial relationships, but have also sort of tried to appear a little bit more ambiguous internationally, have tried to allude that they are interested in engaging in, with a sort of a free world, for lack of a better term, the kind of more democratic-led world order. They've kind of given up that pretense, and they appear to have quite decisively indicated that they see each other as the best partners, and they're not all that interested in making the kind of compromises that it takes to engage internationally. North Korea has made it pretty clear that if engagement in international forums like the UN or with the US or with South Korea, if that is all contingent upon giving up its nuclear weapons, then it would rather not do that. And so until we have a kind of more, some way of addressing that big sticking point, I think it's, as Thomas alluded, I think it's unlikely that it would be nice if there were some kind of diplomatic solution. People who analyze world affairs, we always like to believe that if we sit across from a table, we can come to the conclusion that we have more to gain by working together than by bickering with each other. But when there's just, I think what IR theorists might call non-overlapping positions, if it comes down to you have to give up your nuclear weapons or there is no interchange, and then North Korea just refusing to do so, I don't see a way forward there. I guess it therefore comes to seem prudent that Yoon has done what he has, and he has said, we are going to cooperate with our own allies, and we will leave the door open if North Korea is willing to make some kind of big concession. But I'm certainly not holding my breath for that.
Right. And like Stephen said, though, Washington has highlighted, has underscored continuously that it is very open to dialogue with North Korea. And that being said, then, Thomas, what are your thoughts on the prospects of a multinational negotiation or engagement attempt with regard to North Korea?
It's also hard to picture something like the six-party talks happening. I mean, that seems like a crazy dream now in a way, to imagine China, Russia, North Korea, South Korea, US, Japan, all together in one room hashing this out. And I think the stakes of anything like that would be different now. Again, I think North Korea is just, the idea of denuclearizing is very much off the table. The West, I think we have seen, in a way, multilateralism as a principle growing certainly from Washington's perspective, as opposed to, say, the Trump administration having a more America First approach to things. I mean, I think we've seen just around the response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and, sort of strengthening of NATO. I mean, we've seen multilateralism, or at least bigger kind of partnerships in this sort of Western or democratic-led world. And also, as Steven said, I mean, where North Korea and Russia are now, it's hard to sort of extricate them. But, that also is a relationship of convenience, I think, for both of them. I don't know that, I could see situations changing that might alter that chemistry. I mean, we'll see where is Russia in, regards to Ukraine in a year's time. And maybe if they're suffering badly, that might also kind of pull North Korea away. I mean, I think maybe the wild card is China, as far as, there's no love lost between Beijing and Washington now, but, from their own interest, I mean, they have something to, they have concerns that don't necessarily align exactly with Russia and North Korea. And I think, the more North Korea does to disrupt this region, I mean, there may be a point that China does not want that to happen. I mean, they want a sort of stability here. And, so it could be also a question of interest where, does China find it in its own interest worth, maybe at least working with the U.S. and other partners to sort of try and, get North Korea in some ways constrained. I don't know exactly what that would look like. But again, yeah, it doesn't seem like something now that's easy to envision, but I would also say, so many things are in the air and could change. So, after those six-party talks, it's, North Korea bombed or shelled Yongpyong-do like not long after those fell apart. So, the tide can really turn quickly, as we've seen as well in this region.
Right, quite unpredictable then. Meanwhile, Steven, moving forward, Seoul and Moscow, they've shared a few tense words, the two governments, that is, in recent days. Could you give us a bit background of that interaction, and what do you suppose are the broader implications?
My understanding is what set this off was President Yoon accusing North Korea of violating international law, or ignoring international law, I think was the word he used, in its weapons transactions with Russia. And a spokesperson for the Russian Foreign Ministry took exception to that, and she kind of accused Yoon of being hypocritical. And she said that the blame for the tense state of affairs on the Korean Peninsula was a consequence of Yoon's kind of swaggering posture and all the military exercises that South Korea has undertaken with the U.S. and the shows of military might that those two allies have undertaken. I mean, you can parse that however you want. It's probably beyond me to really say who's to blame here, but I just think what it is a kind of bubbling into the open of two countries that have customarily had at least close economic relations. There's a lot of South Korean companies operate in China, and there's a fair bit of trade between the two sides. But as North Korea and Russia become closer and closer, that seems to be causing friction in the bilateral relationship between Seoul and Moscow. This is probably the most public explosion that these two sides have had, and at least as of now, it's basically just on the level of rhetoric. What this all kind of taking a step back, a lot of what I think will determine this is just how decisive South Korea is in condemning Russia's war on Ukraine. I mean, the bilateral relationship keeps kind of circling back to that, just to what extent Seoul is willing to provide aid to Ukraine, whether that's just humanitarian aid or if they go as far as to provide lethal weaponry. So far, they have been reluctant to do that. And if Seoul was to do something like that, take that kind of open step, then I think the relationship could deteriorate that much more. But perhaps more likely than that is the two sides will realize that they do have some things in common. And I imagine diplomats from the two sides are probably meeting behind the scenes and trying to patch things up as best they can.
Right. Thomas, separately, earlier last week, North Korean workers based in China clashed with their regime's ruling party over unpaid wages. Could you tell us a bit more about this, including, of course, the broader concerns of this rather what pundits called unprecedented conflict?
Yeah, it's, well, it's hard to verify what actually happened. I mean, this is based on reports in local media, quoting, an analyst at the think tank, the Korea Institute of National Unification, saying that it was in Jilin province that a bunch of workers there kind of rioted, had violent protests, ended up killing one of their these are North Korean workers working in China, killing one of the North Korean officials that was sent there to oversee them and injuring others over this anger over unpaid wages. Apparently they hadn't been paid for months. And that also follows, there was a report as well from a former North Korean diplomat who's been here in South Korea for a long time, Ko Young-hwan, who mentioned that there were thousands of protesters in other places in China, at like clothing factories, fisheries, that were also holding protests over this unpaid wages issue, which, it's big if true. I don't know, we know exactly what it is, and but if it were in some version accurate, that's something we really have not seen. I think, this scale of protest actions by North Koreans, especially in other countries. And I mean, what that represents is really a lot of things. I think the fact that anyone who's working overseas, any North Korean that's working overseas, whether they may not be high ranking, but they have to be from some sort of trusted background or trusted family. So these are kind of people that should be considered more loyal or have like closer ties to the regime. So if they're the ones that are expressing this, serious dissatisfaction, literally killing someone over it, that's sort of shakes a few, rattles a few leaves, and I think in Pyongyang in terms of what does that mean going forward. If you're losing that support base, and if those people are coming back to North Korea or talking to people within North Korea. So, it's hard to, of course, know what comes out of that, but this is another one of those factors where there's so many things that are hard to predict. A lot of analysts, sometimes look at the idea of if there's going to be any change in North Korea, it's going to have to come from within the House, or something where there's enough discontent, maybe from high enough ranking people that it, whether it is a regime change or just, forces the regime to change course a bit. It's sort of playing in that frame. It's interesting to see what if anything else comes from it.
Right, especially with pundits, some of them claiming that such situation is perhaps what's ramping up rhetoric by North Korea's Kim Jong-un to kind of direct the discontent of his public, that is, to more security-related issues. Right. Well, that is all the time we have for this edition. Thomas, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts. And Stephen, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, well, that is all the time we have for today's edition of Issues and Insiders. We return same time tomorrow. That is Wednesday. Do join us then.